Welcome to Kids Talk Church History, a one-of-a-kind podcast where kids investigate the history of the church. Over 2,000 years ago, Jesus said, "I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it." So, has he kept his promise? How has Jesus built and preserved his church against all odds? Come with us on a trip through history to find the answer, here on Kids Talk Church History.
Before dying, a country pastor named George Herbert gave to a friend a collection of poems he had written during his life. He had mostly written them for his own encouragement. Some were prayers to God. As he was about to leave this life, he gave his friend permission to publish them if he thought they could offer some comfort to any dejected poor soul. If not, they could be burned. His friend published them, and since then, many dejected poor souls have found much comfort in Herbert's writings. In fact, they have often united people who disagree in other ways. Even Charles I read them before his execution. I am Trinity. I am 17 and I live in Charleston, South Carolina.
I am Mina. I am 15 and I live in Kalamazoo, Michigan.
My name is Sean. I am 13 and I live in Augusta, Kansas.
I think I've heard about George Herbert, but I can't remember any of his poems. I had to look him up.
I found out a fun fact. George W. Bush is actually named after George Herbert. George Herbert Walker Bush.
Well, at least the Bush family knows about him.
Yeah, another fun fact about George Herbert is that some of his poems were shaped like objects. He would line up the words in a way that they looked like different things. For example, an altar or wings.
I remember studying that in school. It's called a calligram.
I remember that too. But Herbert's poems are worth reading, especially for their message. He lived soon after the Reformation, so his poems are full of the gospel. They are also very beautiful. You can say he had a way with words. Many of his poems are prayers.
Speaking of having a way with words, I've read his poems before where he describes prayer with a bunch of images. The church's banquet, angel's age, God's breath in man returning to his birth, the Milky Way, the bird of paradise, and the lands of spices.
That's really cool. It makes me think about each description to see how prayer is like that. One of my favorite poems by Herbert is called The Caller, where he talks about his frustrations. He came from one of the noblest families in England, and he was even a member of Parliament, but left it all to serve in a tiny country parish where he didn't seem to be appreciated. He wrote, "I struck the board and cried, 'No more I will abroad. What? Shall I ever sigh and pine? My lines and life are free, free as the road, loose as the wind.'" He wanted to escape it all, but then he ends the poem like this. "But as I raved and grew more fierce and wild, at every word, methought I heard one calling, 'Child,' and I replied, 'My Lord.'"
It's like Jesus said, "My sheep hear my voice." Sometimes we can be rebellious, but then Jesus calls us back.
I like how they speak a lot like Shakespeare. Methought. Maybe I'll start thinking like that, talking like that.
Methinks people will find you strange.
That's okay. I actually don't know much about Herbert, but John Milton is one I know best. A few years back, I found and read a sentence of John Milton's Paradise Lost and decided it wasn't really the type of book I liked. I really like fantasy novels, so I didn't really finish it or come back to it until now.
And now, do you like it?
I started reading it after I saw that John Milton was one of the people we could study or talk about on this podcast. I'm only on the first book still, but my favorite quote from it so far would have to be, "We were all born like Adam, having lost our paradise." And then it goes on to say how God redeemed us. But there were other poets like Herbert around the same time, right?
Yes, another poet during this time was John Donne. He was the one who wrote the sentence, "No man is an island." Another saying from him is, "Don't ask for whom the bell tolls because it tolls for you." These are his actual words. "Any man's death diminishes me because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee."
We don't usually think this way, but maybe we should.
Yeah, poetry really makes you think. And John Bunyan also wrote some poems, but they weren't as famous as his other works.
I think it depends if you like poetry. I don't know if many kids our age read poetry for fun, unless you count Dr. Seuss.
Yeah, I think you're right, Sean. I think people today don't normally look for poetry books, not like you see them doing in old movies where people quoted poems to each other or where they would get together in a living room and someone would just read a poem out loud.
That's because they didn't have the miracle that is television.
As usual, we could go on, but we'd better let our guest, Dr. David Parry, tell us more. Dr. Parry is a tutorial fellow in English at Regent's Park College in Oxford, England. Dr. Parry, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's great to be with you, and thanks for the invitation.
Of course. Before we start, can you explain what a tutorial fellow is? I imagine fellow doesn't just mean guy, like he's a jolly good fellow.
Thank you. So my full job title is actually I'm the Director of Studies and Tutorial Fellow in English at Regent's Park College, which is one of the colleges at the University of Oxford. And I realize that's a bit of a mouthful, so I just break it down a little bit. So basically, the Director of Studies part means I'm in charge of organizing the teaching for students of English language and literature at Regent's Park College, which is a college in Oxford University. But tutorial fellow, basically what that means is I provide tutorial teaching in English literature. And tutorials are one of the main kinds of teaching at Oxford University. And basically what that means is instead of having a big class with lots of students, I have discussions about English literature and its context with small groups of students, so maybe 2 or 3 students or sometimes one-on-one. So it's a bit more like we're having today. And that's the kind of teaching that I mostly do. And so that's what the tutorial fellow does.
That's amazing. And I've read that you were mostly interested in writers from the 16th to 18th centuries, and especially Puritans like John Bunyan and John Milton. How did you become interested in this subject?
Thanks for the question. So I've always loved reading. So that's from before I started school when I was very little. And so growing up, I read all kinds of books I was interested in, particularly in history, also in philosophy and theology, and in literature, obviously, as well. So I got interested in this period of literature, so 16th to 17th century literature, pretty young. So early on, I got into Shakespeare, plays of William Shakespeare, maybe when I was about 8 or 9, so quite young. And that came out of my interests in history to start with, but then I kind of got into the plays and got into the literature of the periods. And then when I was a teenager, I actually read Milton's Paradise Lost. And that had a particular interest for me as a Christian because of its biblical subject matter, which I know we're going to talk about a bit more later on in our discussion. I think I got a bit more interested in studying Puritan writers more seriously on an academic level as a university student, and that's partly because of my perspective as a Christian. I was interested in the personal way in literature from this period, but then as a Christian, I was interested in developing a Christian perspective on literature and what's going on in literature and how it works. And one of the things that's interesting about writers like Bunyan and Milton is that they're a bit different maybe to some other Puritan writers and some other kind of Christian writers, because a lot of Puritan writers were basically ministers who published books of sermons and other kind of books of Christian teaching. They're a bit more of a direct didactic form. So things like sermons and pamphlets and catechisms, which are basically teaching in question and answer format. And actually, Bunyan read a lot of books of that kind as well. He read a lot of those kind of more didactic books, which are not really read very much today. But Bunyan and Milton also write more literary kinds of writing, so poems and stories that try to communicate biblical truths and influence the reader through appealing to their imagination. And perhaps even persuade the reader towards conversion and towards godly life through a kind of way of converting the imagination. So I actually wrote a book about this, which is called The Rhetoric of Conversion in English Puritan Writing from Perkins to Milton. And rhetoric is basically a technical term for the art of persuasion. It's basically all about that, how people like Bunyan and Milton use the imagination to try to persuade people towards Christian faith and the Christian life.
Many people think Paradise Lost is one of the greatest epic poems in English. Do you agree? Why is it important for people to read Paradise Lost today? I actually have a copy of it.
That's great. I'm glad to see that. So yeah, I got into Paradise Lost when I was young. I've got a couple of different editions on my shelf. So I definitely agree with that. I definitely agree it is one of the greatest epic poems in English. It's one of these classic works of literature that basically any student of English literature would have to read pretty much, or they should have to read. And so actually next week, I'm discussing Paradise Lost with my students in Oxford. So Paradise Lost is definitely worth reading. For a lot of reasons. It's not necessarily the easiest style for first-time readers, particularly if we're not so familiar with poetic language and language from that kind of period in the 17th century. But I recommend there's a website that I actually contributed to called Darkness Visible, which is hosted by Christ College at the University of Cambridge, which gives a user-friendly introduction to Paradise Lost and also to Milton's life and some of the historical context of his work, including a bit about the Bible. I kind of, not everyone who contributed to that website was a Christian, but I got the Bible part because I knew some more stuff about the Bible, so they gave me that bit, which I enjoyed. But there are lots of reasons to read Paradise Lost. From a kind of literature point of view, kind of literary studies point of view, it uses techniques from classical epics, so from works like the Odyssey and the Aeneid, from ancient Greek and Roman writers, but it uses those techniques to tell a biblical story. And basically, it is the story of the creation and the fall of humanity that comes from Genesis chapters 1 to 3, which only take up a few pages in the Bible, but Milton expands it into a very long poem, which, depending on the edition you have, goes on for hundreds of pages, thousands of lines of poetry. So obviously he has to kind of expand the narrative quite a lot. He uses imagination to expand the story. And one of the ways it's like classical epics, like Homer's Odyssey, is that it doesn't start at the beginning of the story. It starts more in the middle. So it starts with Satan and the fallen angels in hell, plotting their revenge against God. And that's where Satan gets the idea to tempt God's new creation of humans into sin, to kind of basically get his own back against God. There are also other fun things about Paradise Lost. There's actually, I think you mentioned you're into sci-fi. It's one of the first uses of the word space to mean outer space. There's a line says, I think it's actually Satan who says this, like space may create new worlds, or something like that. I might have forgot the exact wording. That idea of outer space is in Paradise Lost. But then from a Christian point of view, I think Paradise Lost is great in helping us to engage imaginatively with that biblical narrative of the creation and fall. And so it's not necessarily a definitive interpretation of Genesis that tells you exactly how it all went down. But it kind of helps those biblical figures to kind of come off the page. It helps us to imagine what it might have been like for Adam and Eve, and for the angels to come and talk with Adam and Eve and tell them about the creation, war in heaven, all that stuff. And even it has Satan and God himself as characters who have motivations that are kind of analysed by Milton. So there's a bit where Satan actually considers repenting, and then he decides he's not able to do that. That kind of raises some tricky theological questions about whether or not Satan could repent if he wanted to. But it's interesting to think about. And it also explores some of the motivations for the falls and the more kind of human motivations that Adam and Eve might have had. So it kind of starts off when Adam and Eve says, well, let's work separately so that we can be more efficient in looking after the garden that God has given us to look after. But that kind of leaves her open to temptation, it leaves her vulnerable to being tempted by the serpent because she's isolated on her own. And then actually Adam is not actually deceived by the serpent, but he kind of willingly chooses to follow Eve in kind of eating the fruit and kind of falling into sin because he doesn't want to be separated from his wife. So it's kind of out of a love for his wife, but I guess applied in a bit of a twisted way. So it's interesting in terms of exploring that kind of human motivation and thinking what would it have been like and bringing it to life. But then finally, I really like Paradise Lost because it ends on a note of hope. So even though Adam and Eve they fall into sin and they have to leave the garden, they're actually repentant, they have a sense of remorse, and they leave the garden kind of trusting in God to guide them into the future. And I really like these last lines of the poem, which say this. It says, the world was all before them, where to choose their place of rest, and providence their guide. They hand in hand with wandering steps and slow, through Eden took their solitary way. So it's a great poem. I recommend you read it.
Wow, that's awesome. There's some amazing things about it because I just be in my room at night trying to read this incredibly small print. I don't even know if you can see it or not, but it's like incredibly small just to fit it all on the page. But I've also read in different articles that Milton was blind. How do you think this condition affected his poetry?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's actually something he refers to in Paradise Lost. So Paradise Lost, he was blind. He wasn't blind from birth. He became blind later in life, in his 40s. But he was blind when he wrote Paradise Lost. So basically, he had to dictate it to other scribes who would write down. He would say the line, and someone else would write it down for him, which is quite amazing in terms of the length of the work and how he had to do that. And he actually refers to it at certain points. He kind of references his blindness in the poem. At one point, he says something about that light at one entrance is quite shut out. So he's referring to he can't physically see. He doesn't have physical light to see. But he says he's kind of inwardly illuminated. He has the light of the Holy Spirit within him, illuminating his vision of this biblical narrative. So going back a little bit to talk about Milton's life, obviously someone I have a lot of interest in. Milton, just briefly, he was born in London, and I feel like a bit of a connection with Milton as well, because he then went to study at Christ College at the University of Cambridge, which is actually where I was a student. So there were like statues of Milton around the college and his portraits. And there's a tree in the garden that it's called Milton's mulberry tree. I don't think we know for sure whether he was actually sat under the tree, but that's kind of the story. And actually, once a year, there's a dinner. To celebrate the life of the college, and at midnight all the students like gather around the tree and they kind of dance around the mulberry tree at midnight and think about Milton. So that's kind of fun. After that, Milton, he lived in quite turbulent times. I think on some of your other podcasts you might have talked a bit about the Civil War, and in England and across the British Isles at that time, the Civil War was basically between the King and the Parliament, King Charles I. I think Trinity mentions at the start, and ended with the King, Parliament basically winning and the King being beheaded. Milton was basically on the parliamentarian side, and he actually ended up wrote pamphlets to defend the execution of the King. It was very controversial, but kind of through that he ended up with a job working for Oliver Cromwell. And so Oliver Cromwell is the parliamentarian army commander, basically, who ended up as the leader of the country, the Lord Protector. And Milton was basically part of his government, which was great at the time, but not so great when after Cromwell died and the monarchy was restored, the old king's son came back to be king. And Milton was quite fortunate to escape with his head. He had another friend, Andrew Marvell, another poet, who basically intervened to get Milton spare his life. So he lived in these kind of turbulent times, and it was during that period that he actually went blind while he was working for Cromwell. And some of the royalists, the people on the king's side, saw that as a punishment, kind of judgment from God. But Milton, yeah, he's kind of broadly Puritan in his theology, or he's on the Puritan side. The Puritans often kind of align with the parliamentarians, broadly speaking. And so Milton's kind of on the Puritan side, but some of his theology is a little bit off by more mainstream Orthodox Christian standards. So, for instance, he doesn't seem to have subscribed to a kind of Orthodox view of the Trinity. That doesn't really come across particularly in Paradise Lost. Scholars debate that a bit. It's some of Milton's other writing that wasn't published in his lifetime, where he kind of criticizes the Trinity. So there are some things that are kind of not unorthodox in Milton's theology, but I think he's still a lot of valuable insights for Christian readers in Milton. And yeah, just finishing off on Milton's blindness, actually, he reflects on this in quite a moving poem, which is Milton's Sonnet 19, that begins, "When I consider how my life is spent." And he talks about how he's anxious about being unable to serve God because of his blindness, and whether God will be unhappy with him for wasting his talents. But he gets a response. He has this voice, the voice of patience, that speaks to him and says, God does not need either man's work or his own gifts. And it finishes with this kind of comparison between the angels. There are these angels who are actively serving God. It says, thousands at his bidding speed and post or land and ocean without rest. So these angels flying around doing God's will. But there are also angels who are just attending on God. And the poem finishes, they also serve who only stand and wait. So we can serve God just by kind of waiting on God, even if we can't actively do a lot with our outward lives, which I think is an encouraging message for the Christian reader.
I've read about some women who wrote poems around the same time, Lucy Hutchinson and Mary Sidney. Do you know much about them, and are there more?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I know a little bit about them, and there are definitely more out there. There's been a lot of scholarship in literary studies about writing by women in the 16th and 17th century. So in the past few decades, there's been a lot of work on women writers, and all kinds of writing. So it's got love poetry, recipe books, all kinds of things. But a lot of it is broadly what we call kind of religious writing. So poetry or sermon notes, writing on kind of Christian themes. And actually, that's one of the areas in which writing by women was kind of more accepted. So a lot of that, there's a big proportion of the women's writing is kind of religious on Christian themes. And yeah, those writers you mentioned are a great example. So Lucy Hutchinson, she was called Lucy Apsley when she was born. She was educated, basically her father encouraged her to be educated in Latin and Greek. Her mother thought that was a bit too much education for a girl, but encouraged her to memorize sermons instead. And the two sides of her education kind of came together in her writing as an adult. So she translated works from Latin, she wrote theological works. But one poem she's famous for is called Order and Disorder. And that's actually another version of Genesis in the form of a poem. So it's kind of similar to Paradise Lost. But there's a bit more going through chapter by chapter than Milton does. So that's definitely worth a read. Yeah, Mary Sidney was a poet, translator, and she wrote her own poems, but she's particularly famous for finishing off the work of her brother, Philip Sidney, who was also a poet who died young, fighting as a soldier. And Philip Sidney began basically turning the Psalms into English poems. So they're kind of paraphrases, not exactly translations, but poems inspired by the Psalms. And Mary Sidney actually finished off going through all the Psalms and turning them into English poetry. And this is known as the Sidney Psalter. And yeah, there are definitely many others out there. So one of the authors of probably the first sonnet sequence in English was called Anne Vaughan Locke, and that was a sequence of sonnets that was based on Psalm 51. So a lot of women writers out there to check out.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite poet from this time period or a favorite poem?
Thank you. So I always find it a bit tricky to answer questions about what's my favorite author or my favorite book, but I do have a special place for George Herbert. I know we talked a bit more about Herbert in your introduction, so you covered a lot of the things I was planning to say, but yeah, he's a great writer. So as you mentioned, Herbert had quite a privileged background, but he effectively gave that up to become minister of the Church of England, to become clergyman in a little country parish, where he ministered. It was just for about 3 years before he died, so not for that long really, but it's really that period of his life that he's best remembered for, and he died at age 39 from tuberculosis. And I think he mentioned his collection of poems, which is called The Temple, which was published after his death. And it's structured around, it's like walking through a church building, and some of the poems reflect on these symbolic objects like the altar. And you mentioned his poems. Some of his poems are in the shape of pictures of things like the church altar or angels' wings. So George Herbert has a special place for my wife and I. So we read Herbert's poems together when we were engaged, and we actually had a reading from one of his poems at our wedding, which is a poem called Love 3, which I recommend you check out, which is all about basically God, the figure of love, inviting us to sit down and eat with him. And the author kind of feels unworthy, but is persuaded to sit down and eat with this figure of love, who kind of represents God or Jesus in that context. So yeah, George Herbert definitely has a special place.
That's great. So some of our listeners are quite young. Can you think of any poem by the poets that we mentioned that can be enjoyed by even younger kids?
Thank you. So you mentioned in the intro, that John Bunyan wrote some poems, and It's not really the work he's best remembered for. So I know you had a podcast on Bunyan. He's most famous for the Pilgrim's Progress and his spiritual memoir and some other stories, some other allegorical stories that he wrote. But he did write some poems, and he actually wrote a collection of poems for children called A Book for Boys and Girls. And some of them need a little bit of explanation for modern readers, but I think there are some that could still be understood today, even by quite young readers with maybe a bit of help. So I've got a poem you might like called Upon the Snail by John Bunyan.
Perfect.
Yeah, that's a great poem.
Good. So besides reading poetry, do you have any other hobbies?
Yeah, so my wife and I had a baby last year, who's now 7 months old. So at the moment, we don't have a lot of time for hobbies. But as well as, well, we both love reading all kinds of books. But apart from reading, my wife and I enjoy walking. We enjoy getting outside and enjoying the open air. We enjoy good food, and we're also actively involved with our church community. So those are the kind of things we do with the spare time that we have.
That's great.
Dr. Parry, we are so thankful that you decided to spend this time with us and share those wonderful answers to the questions that we asked. And listeners, keep telling us what you think of these episodes and keep asking questions. We'll pass them on to our guest experts as soon as possible. And we're always having giveaways, so make sure that you enter on our website, kidstalkchurchhistory.org. In a partnership with the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals, and on behalf of my co-hosts, Mina and Sean, I am Trinity. Thank you so much for listening to Kids Talk Church History.